Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Depew, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. The Dole Student Advisory Board is comprised of KU students committed to work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this, and plan an SAB-sponsored event every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback will help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. We would like to encourage each of you to consider becoming friends of the Dole Institute. Our friends help keep our programs free and open and support archive, research, and our student activities. Please contact us if you're interested. Before we begin today, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student volunteer with a microphone will come to you. Please just ask one brief question. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Babb.
Well, it's good to be here. Last month it was Dr. Gary Bjorge, and he talked about the Eastern way of war. And I'm kind of the follow-on to Gary because I want to talk about how the Western way of war has infiltrated in to East Asia. And then you can decide for yourself after you've put together what Gary said and what I said where the future of the Asian way of war is going. I get interested in this based on my dissertation, which was on the U.S. military advisors to China, 1941 to 1951. So as part of that, I wanted to go backwards to see where Western armies or Westerners had advised the Chinese in the past, and I also wanted to bring in the Japanese, since they're certainly the major player when you look at the 1941 through 45 piece of my dissertation. So I've outlined on here, what I want to look at, and there is a couple of chapters in this book importing the European armies that I went back to try to start the research. As a China guy, and I'm a China guy, not a Japan guy, and I don't see Tom Huber here, which is too bad because I'd immediately turn around to Tom Huber if a Japanese question comes up and let him answer it. As the China guy, John King Fairbank is the guy to read, was the guy to read. Today it's Jonathan Spence, and I'll talk about Jonathan Spence a little bit later on. But certainly John King Fairbank and what he said about how the Western world came to China seems to be as true today as when he originally said it, which basically first come the merchants and then come the military to try to figure out how to protect the merchants and the lines of communication for where that merchandise goes, and then in come the missionaries, or probably in modern days today, the culture piece. Well, thankfully Tom arrived to do the Japan piece that I can't answer. It says the Western way of war. The Western way of war was described in the Cambridge History of China of warfare as this: technology, discipline, training, professional standing army, highly aggressive military tradition, the offensive, emphasis on innovation, and of course, you got to finance it somehow. And for those that study both Japan and China, financing is always a problem and a different sort of issue. But this is the Western way of war, and I'm going to argue there are pieces of this that are brought to both China and Japan that were exhibited as early as the 1850s and continue to be seen today. One of the issues that comes up often is, what is China doing? Well, China keeps talking about the century of humiliation, the 110 years of humiliation. And that's what I propose to focus on and to cover, and that is 1839, from the Opium War through the standing up of the People's Republic of China. The map that you see is a schematic that I found doing a little research that outlines what one could argue is what China wants. One of the questions that's out there is, what does China want? If you go to something called Tian Sha, all under heaven, then they want to control the whole globe. I don't particularly think that's true. What I think is this map of essentially Qing Dynasty China with areas of influence around it provide a defensive posture. Back to Sun Tzu, and I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time with Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu. Basically, he says invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the offense, which says to me China is essentially a defensive nation. And what China does militarily is essentially defensive. The question then becomes, defend what? And the other issue normally becomes, when you look at China's wars since 1959, essentially against us in Korea, against the Indians in 62, against the Vietnamese in 79, they certainly are offensively defensive in the way they act, which adds to the further confusion. 1839, the first Opium War. And it's in some ways complicated, in some ways not very complicated. The Brits have a big problem of balance of trade with China. They're getting the goods out of China and they're having to pay silver for it, and there's essentially nothing that the Chinese want to trade in return. And so the Brits have to have something to trade, and they come upon opium. And the in Beijing sends Minister Lin down to Hong Kong to stop the opium trade being carried out by the British merchants. So if you want to have a drug cartel, it's essentially the Brits. And essentially what happens is the Brits go to war for the principle of free trade. Whether what they're trading in happens to be opium, but that's a minor problem, just write in free trade. And then what comes about from that is a problem for the Chinese. They get soundly defeated. The interesting thing is the Chinese forces that are defeated by the British are normally holding where they were when the battle's over. So if you think that whoever holds the battlefield is the victor, the Chinese are sending reports back to Beijing that they're actually winning. They're taking a terrible beating, but they're where they were when they started in many cases. But sooner or later, they finally figure they're getting hammered. And they sign the Treaty of Nanking. And at the Treaty of Nanking, they get Hong Kong in perpetuity. So we can answer questions about 1997 Hong Kong later, but in essence, the Treaty of Nanking, what we'll do 2 years later is we will get most favored nation. So you all remember when most favored nation back in the Clinton administration was all over the news. It was slapping the Chinese in the face every time you said most favored nation. Because during the 1800s, when any of the foreign powers signed a treaty with the Chinese, every other foreign power got the same rules applied to them. So for most favored nations, that essentially meant extraterritoriality, that no matter what these foreigners did in China, they were going to be tried back home. And that is a very debilitating loss of sovereignty for any kind of a nation. We did the Treaty of Wangsha in 1844, and we get the same treatment as the Brits for our people that are trading in China. And we also get, and they're marked in the red circles, these, by the time it's over, 14 treaty ports. And that's where we basically begin to make inroads into China, to include into the Yangtze River inland from Shanghai. The next major war that starts to have issues is the Taiping Rebellion. And the wonderful looking gentleman that you have there on your left is Hong Shui-chuan, and he's Jesus Christ's younger brother. And he believes it. And for a while, the missionaries in China are going, well, to Christianize 400 million Chinese, this is going to be good. But as Jonathan Spence, the Chinese historian today at Yale and probably one of the preeminent historian in the United States on China, in his book you'll see Hong Shui-chuan rewrote key passages of the Bible to make them more applicable to China. And even the Baptists turned him over after a while as not being quite right. But he did form the heavenly kingdom of peace. And he was very successful. On the map it shows where he starts. And he starts as a young man down here in Guangxi province and gathers his troops and slowly moves until he gets to Nanjing. And he will be in Nanjing in 1853 and set up his capital there. And they will last for a decade. He will make a foray towards Beijing and will fail. It is the foray towards Shanghai that will cause the Westerners to begin to train, equip, and work alongside the Chinese military. Because once it's decided that these guys are bad for China, the foreign powers wanting to maintain their trade along the coast will essentially help the Chinese to fight Hong Shui-chuan and the Taipings. The most famous is Frederick Townsend Ward. Frederick Townsend Ward is he's from Massachusetts. He's not a soldier, he's not a sailor, he's an adventurer. And he will form the ever-victorious army. He will be paid handsomely by the Chinese, Li Hongzhang, who I'll show a picture of later, to protect Shanghai from the Taipings. His army will have Filipinos, other Americans, and Chinese. It will be equipped with Western equipment in part. And he will become a brigadier general equivalent in the Chinese army, marry a Chinese woman, and then be stupid enough to get mortally wounded in an early fight. He will be replaced by Chinese Gordon. Chinese Gordon doesn't get wounded, doesn't die here. He waits to do that in Khartoum. But Chinese Gordon, the replacement for Frederick Townsend Ward at the time, is a British engineer captain when he will take over this Western-led, trained, and equipped ever-victorious army. At the same time, there are two Chinese that are part of the central government, but they're part of the political and regional apparatus. And so these two gentlemen, Zhang Guofang and Li Hongzhang, are the most prominent names of those Chinese that understand they have to change the way their military operates. And they will form these regional armies with some Western equipment, some training, and they will buy mercenaries like Frederick Townsend Ward, and they will effectively oppose the Taiping. When the Taiping are finally defeated in 1865, over 20 million Chinese will have died. So when you look at the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, which is about the same time this is going on here, and which does affect the amount of weapons and equipment that China can buy on the open market, especially from the United States. This is a significant number. In the meantime, in the middle of Hong Sui-chuan's Taiping Rebellion, we have a second Opium War. And the second Opium War happens, it's also sometimes called the Arrow War, when the Chinese basically attempt to take a British flagged ship. Now there's multiple stories of this, that one, it wasn't a British flagged ship, it wasn't British crewed, there was no Brits on it. So it's hard to know. It seems to have been a British ship with British cargo, and the war begins because of this slight to the Brits. At the Treaty of Tianjin in 1868, the Chinese agree to terms, and then almost immediately don't do it. Now the Chinese have an interesting way to look at an unequal treaty. Any treaty that you are forced to sign by force of arms is only as good as the time that you have the force of arms to keep your foot on their neck. As soon as the situation changes, that treaty's not worth much. And arguably, that's one of the problems the United States has today when we look at a treaty with China. A treaty is only good when both sides mutually agree for mutual interest to do something. If there's force used on either side, it's just something that's going to take place for a while until the situation changes. So at the end of the day, the situation changes, they sign it, they sign it. But the Brits and the French, with some American military assistance, will seize Beijing, burn the Summer Palace. So the Summer Palace that's in China today that you can go to, there are pieces like this piece down here that's still there with no change. But if you've been to the Summer Palace, it doesn't look like this. So this was the Summer Palace that was burned. Once again, the Chinese are absolutely and utterly humiliated. A small force of Brits and French take the capital of China and sack the Summer Palace. And the stories about the way the French and British troops acted towards the Chinese is also not very favorable. But then again, those Brits that were captured by the Chinese were also not well taken care of, including a group that was sent to conduct negotiations. And then there's the wonderful lady, the Empress Dowager Cixi, and the self-strengthening movement. There are many Chinese that are starting to get it. The Westerners are coming with more than toys. And what the Westerners are coming with is military equipment, organization, trained and disciplined armies that they cannot defeat on the sea or on land, even when outnumbered, although there are a few battles that the Chinese will win based on sheer numbers alone. So the Empress Cixi, sometimes she's for modernization and sometimes she's not, but the self-strengthening movement will begin. And one arguably is the graduate of Yale, the first Chinese to graduate from an American university, Young Ming. And then he will advocate for more Chinese to come to the United States. And 120 young men will come from China to Connecticut and start college. The problem is they bring all their Confucian scholar instructors with them. So they take American school all day to learn this trivial mechanical stuff, this technological stuff, and then they go back to Confucius and the eight-legged essays at night. The Chinese have a very difficult time breaking away from the Confucian educational roots. The idea that what to think, not how to think, might be important is still arguable. But at the end of the day, the Chinese will begin to make purchases from the French, from the British, from the Americans, I think Remington Arms, to start to build arsenals in China during this self-strengthening movement. The reason 1895 is on there because it starts to fall apart again, and we'll talk about that. Now, got to get back to a little bit of Japan, because the Chinese and Japanese Westernization movements are intertwined. Most people know the story of the black ships. The United States decides to open up Japan. And so the good admiral there decides to sail into Edo Harbor, talk to them a little bit about opening up, go away, come back, Japan opens up. And when they do open up, they go hog wild. They will reach out virtually globally to do this. Now, there is actually a French, and that will be known as the Meiji Restoration. But in 1867, there's actually a French military group on the ground, and it's training the Tokugawa shogunate folks, not the Meiji Restoration folks. So, a series of French groups, military advisors will go into Japan, and then following the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese will say, we're going to get the guys that won. So then the Germans will begin to come in and be their advisors. And then there's this strange guy over here, Semple, he's a Brit. He comes in 1921 to build a Japanese Air Force. He will later be tried for treason by the Brits. But at the end of the day, I think this is a sample of what's happening in Japan, and it's actually happening faster. And the Empress Dowager is not in place here to slow it down or change it. So the Japanese are on a very steep slope for modernization, and they're taking from the best armies and ideas in the world. Meckwell will go back and be part of the German General Staff, which we still study today at CGSC as the model for a staff college. In the meantime, it's time to fight the French. The French are vying for power in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, in Southeast Asia. And so there will be land battles between the French and the Chinese in Vietnam. And then there's a huge sea battle, or set of sea battles. In the self-strengthening movement, the Chinese bought and built modern warships. The problem is they didn't crew them, man them, and captain them well. They didn't have a naval tradition from the time of the Ming Dynasty, when the Ming Emperor basically beached the fleet back in the time in the Ming Dynasty in the 1300s. So what you get is a southern Chinese fleet, the Nanyang fleet, that will fight the French and get hammered. And the Beiyang fleet, the North fleet, doesn't come down to help them. Maybe that was smart, because they would have probably lost more ships if they had. But what you have is another idea, another humiliation on the Chinese of their inability to fight Western powers, even when they have modern equipment. Because it's not only the equipment that matters. It's the leadership, organization, training, and discipline of the unit that matters. And the Chinese don't have it. There's a very interesting American, Philo McGiffin. Philo McGiffin graduates from Annapolis, applies for a commission in the Navy, and is told, we got too many ensigns right now, we don't need any. So he writes a letter to the Chinese and asks for a job in the Chinese Navy. And he gets it. So off he goes to China, and he will fight as a Chinese naval officer against the French in 1844-45. Then he will go to Tianjin and teach in the Chinese Naval War College. And then he will fight in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, get severely wounded to come back to the United States, and die. Strange character. But like Frederick Townsend Ward, an individual that makes an impression, gets to be the right place at the right time. And again, how much should a naval ensign graduating from Annapolis know to be able to go in and teach at another nation's war college? Not so fast. Sino-Japanese War is Canada attacks the United States, Canada wins. It is just almost impossible to believe that Japan could attack China and win. It should have been the wake-up call of all wake-up calls. And for some it was. But for the more powerful, we still have the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty is coming to an end, but at the end of the day, they are still not ready to grasp, like the Japanese did, that you have to have the Western way of war to defeat Western powers. You have got your Eastern way of war ain't working. What's the pieces of it? So what you have in the background, you can see one of the modern ships that was built by the Chinese. But at the end of the day, and as this picture sort of depicts, the Japanese are real military personnel, and the Chinese are kowtowing to the wonderful Japanese in the woodblock. This will be followed by the humiliation of the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Boxers are an interesting bunch. They believe that they cannot be harmed by cutting weapons if they're praying hard enough. And if they really, really pray hard, they're not going to. They don't have to worry about being shot. So when they look to the left and right and somebody's being shot or hacked up, it just doesn't pray very well. So it's a wonderful system if you can make people believe it. There are hundreds of thousands of Boxers. It is the young men with no jobs. It is the young men with nothing to do. It is a movement of leaders. It's hard to find anything written about the leadership of the Boxers. As the Boxers begin to attack the missionaries in the outlying places in and around Beijing, in and around Jinan on Shandong Peninsula, wherever there are missionaries in that northeast getting attacked, the Western governments are telling the Chinese government of the Empress Dowager and her Prince Kong and their military leader, a guy named Yuan Shikai, that he needs to stop this. The Empress Dowager thinks they're doing pretty well, and so the Chinese will declare war on the West. Bad idea. It's hard to see, I'm sorry, in the back, but what I want to point out is this is not just a battle that's over quickly, the Boxer Rebellion. It's a campaign. And in that campaign, you have forces that will move from Tianjin and try to get up and relieve the legations. Again, essentially, this is what we now call a NEO, a non-combatant evacuation. So 2,000 to 3,000 foreigners will attempt to go help the 500 that are up in Beijing. And they will get basically attacked by Boxers and the Chinese Imperial Army. Another approximately 12 to 15,000 will be landed at the Daku forts, and Seymour and his bunch will come back to Tianjin. So 55 days at Peking is 55 days at Peking. 55 days from the start of trying to relieve the legation, the 8 foreign powers will make it into Beijing. And they will not be nice to Beijing. The Japanese will be the occupying power in Beijing The United States will leave troops and we will become the occupying power in Tianjin. The regiment's crest that I have at the bottom are regiments that still exist in the United States Army today that were part of this movement. We were not the primary players in the Boxer Rebellion. The Russians and the Japanese were the two countries that provided the most troops to this fight. And that will lead to more problems later on for those two nations. This is a map of the foreign concessions in Tianjin under the administration of the United States Army. We have administered other countries before, or parts of other countries before. The Russians and the Japanese, who were the two major powers at the Boxer Rebellion, will eventually come to blows. And that will be the Russo-Japanese War. And it's all about Manchuria. In 1894-95, Korea basically came under the control of the Japanese. It will not be an official colony until 1910, but for all intents and purposes, Korea is controlled by Japan in 1895, as is Taiwan. So now the Japanese and the Chinese are going to vie for the Eastern Chinese Railway and Port Arthur. So the Japanese and the Russians will fight on land and on sea, and the Japanese will defeat the Russians in both domains. So an Eastern power using Western military tactics, weapons, and equipment will defeat a major European power. The Japanese have reached nirvana, which is not particularly Shinto, but close enough for government work. At the end of the day, we now have, with Japan, a power on a par with European nations. The United States will continue to provide troops, mostly out of the Philippines, to maintain the corridor from Beijing to the sea. And in 1912, we'll put the 15th Infantry Regiment in there on a permanent basis. So when somebody says, how long did the United States stay and occupy China? It is 1900 to 1941. And by 42, we're back into China, and we'll stay till 49. It is the Japanese that will kick us out of China, not the Chinese, until 1949. For all intents and purposes, then, the 15th Infantry Division is, 15th Infantry Regiment is the regiment to be in the United States Army at the time. You can hang around Fort Riley if you want to, but if you want to be part of the Army most prestigious, then the 15th. And if you look at the officers who served in the 15th, Marshall, Stilwell, Walker, some of the finest generals in World War II and in Asia later will have served there. And Stilwell will try to activate a language program so that he wants the American soldiers there to be culturally attuned with what's going on. Now, the question is, does the 15th Infantry train Chinese? And the answer is no. We are an occupying power. To the best of my knowledge, we never trained any Chinese soldiers during this time. We're not advisors like other nations had been. What else is going on? Let me go into the time. China is fractured. After 1911 and a short period under Yuan Shikai, you get the rise of the warlords. And I just put a sample of warlords up here, and you can kind of see by their dress, it's a mix of Western equipment. A Sam Brown belt's a Sam Brown belt. It's not a Mao Zedong belt. So they look Western in their dress. There are warlords who buy airplanes. There are warlords who have tanks. There are warlords who are getting Western equipment. There are Christian warlords. There's Muslim warlords. there's Buddhist warlords, there's drug warlords. And they inhabit the pink spaces. In the blue spaces is Sun Yat-sen and his chosen military advisor, Chiang Kai-shek. And so Chiang Kai-shek will be asked to put an academy together at a place called Whampoa, which is an island in the Pearl River in Guangzhou in southern China. And at Whampoa, the Russian advisors will come in and begin to train the Chinese army. And they do a pretty good job. It's a bit of a different game, though. Chiang Kai-shek here with Blücher. His son, Jiang Jingguo, will go to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to study. Will marry a Bilo-Russian woman. He will eventually be the president of Taiwan. But for a while, he's just another good communist in Russia. Chiang Kai-shek and this other guy, Zhou Enlai, excuse me, will run the Whampoa Military Academy. Because the communists and the nationalists are essentially one party. They will grow out of something called the Tongmenghui, Sun Yat-sen's party. The Chinese in Taiwan today and in mainland China both look back to Sun Yat-sen as their father. And so Sun Yat-sen, who spent time at Iolani High School in Hawaii, and then he was a medical doctor and spent some time in Britain, and went up and down politically in China, when he dies of cancer, Chiang Kai-shek will take over. And Chiang Kai-shek will do something very interesting. He will do what's called the Northern Expedition. He will attempt to bring together all the different warlords. You can buy them off. You can go to war with them. Or you can just ask them to join your army and be nice because you're the biggest guy on the block. So he uses every kind of means available to get after the warlords. The problem is he never really ever controls all the warlords. And that will trouble him all the way till 1949. And arguably, there's no one single reason that Chiang Kai-shek will lose the Chinese Civil War, but the fact that he's got 500 divisions, of which only about 60 to 80 are of any value to him, is part of the issue. So with the Northern Expedition, he also takes on the communists because Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek are sitting side by side in the office at Whampoa. So the guy, Zhou Enlai, who will be Mao Zedong's second in command from the 1930s all the way through 1976, they will both die in 1976, and Chiang Kai-shek are side by side. And so at Whampoa, you're building the young officer corps of what will be both the nationalist and the communist armies. Predominantly the nationalists, but nevertheless, what you get is a mix. But that ends in 27. The German army will come in to replace the Russian army. Chiang Kai-shek doesn't want the Russians, Stalin's Russians, training his nationalist army after he has attacked Mao and the communists. So Chiang Kai-shek will sort of kick out the Soviets, and he will grab the Germans. Now the Germans are pretty much friends with the Japanese over the next several years, and the Japanese will eventually ask the Germans to stop training the Chinese. Because those those German-trained Chinese units, of which there are supposed to be 60 divisions, will, in 1937, do very, very well initially against the Japanese. So once again, world politics will get in the way, but at the end of the day, Chiang Kai-shek's other son will go to Germany and he will fight with the Nazis. So our buddy Chiang Kai-shek, that lovely Democrat on Taiwan, has got an interesting way of spreading his children around. and he has an interesting way of figuring out what kind of army and system he wants to have. He himself had gone to a Japanese high school, and literally thousands of young Chinese had gone to Japan to get Western war studies, to include Chiang Kai-shek. Then there's this little problem of Manchuria. In the middle of the 30s, the Japanese will take Manchuria, declare Manchukuo, grab Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, and put him in place, and they will assassinate one of the most powerful warlords, Zhang Guofang. That's going to lead to some more problems. But at the end of the day now, the Japanese and its Western-equipped, Western-trained army, and the Chinese, with the mixed bag that they have of warlords, and Chiang's army, and this communist army that's growing, are going to have to figure out how to get together and fight. Well, Chiang Kai-shek just wants to eliminate the communists. He conducts 5 extermination campaigns against the communists while the Japanese are taking over Manchuria. And he loses the first 4. The first 2 very badly, and then a little bit better and a little bit better. And then finally, Chiang Kai-shek gets his stuff together, puts a 1.5 million man army together, and decides it's time to go after the communists and get them. And that will lead to the Long March. Now, the Long March is also interesting in that when Mao gets to Zuni, they'll have a conference. And Mao will bring his Russian advisor from the Comintern in, and in that meeting, they will have a fight over the best methodology to fight the nationalists. Because the method that the European Borodin had been teaching them doesn't work. So Mao will get elected, and guerrilla warfare is the new methodology. How a weaker power can last, stay on, and erode the capabilities of a larger, more powerful army. So protracted guerrilla war begins here at Zuni. When they get to Xi'an, when they get to Yan'an, look, this would be like going to Montana. So this is the worst of Missoula, okay? It's a long friggin' ways from anywhere, and nobody wants to stay very long, okay? Pardon those who are from Missoula. Relatively safe up there, Chiang Kai-shek will fly to Xi'an, and they will plan the 6th extermination campaign. But Zhang Guofang, the son of Zhang Zuolin, who the Japanese had assassinated in Manchuria, kidnaps Chiang Kai-shek and says it's time for the Chinese to come together as one and fight the Japanese and to stop fighting each other. And this is called the Second United Front. The Second United Front will last on paper until 1946. It won't last until 1940, for real. But at the end of the day, there are people who say the only reason that Mao Zedong eventually won in China is because of this contingent act, where he gets saved, he and the communists get saved by this warlord who brings the idea that it's time now for the Chinese to fight the Japanese and stop fighting each other. There's about 10 other contingencies. One of the things that I didn't mention in the middle of this, because I'm an Army guy and not a Navy guy, is the United States Navy patrolled the Yangtze River from 1854, again, helping American economic interests along the Yangtze River in the middle of the Taiping Rebellion until 1949. So for the Navy guys in the audience, the Yangpat, that part of the Asiatic fleet that's internal in China, is a very long-lasting organization. This Colonel Roberts, who is a distant relative of Senator Roberts, was an American Army major who happened to be taking a ride up to Nanjing one day on the USS Panay. And the Panay is attacked by the Japanese. a half a dozen or more Americans will be killed, more wounded. He will stand up as the leader in the chaos and will be awarded a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. He will later become, as Colonel Roberts, General Stilwell's intelligence officer in China, Burma, India. And of course, everybody needs to go home and watch Sand Pebbles. It's a great untrue movie. All right. All of this mess is going on, and we're going to have a World War II. We have a united front in China, and everything's going well, so what we need to do then is have a reason to fight the Japanese, and the Japanese won't be long in giving it. So World War II begins at the Marco Polo Bridge, northwest Beijing, July 1937. And now we have, again, the communists and the nationalists are united, and they're going to begin to fight the Japanese. Unfortunately, the Germans had only been able to build and equip about 20 Chinese divisions, not 60. They were incomplete. They didn't have enough artillery, and they didn't have anywhere near enough air power. So when they attempt to fight the Japanese in Shanghai, they do very well in ground-to-ground engagements. The trouble is, with naval gunfire and Japanese control of the air, they slowly get beat. And Chiang Kai-shek does not pull them back fast enough. He doesn't seem to recognize when he's not in a good position. If you know the range of the naval gunfire, get out of it. He orders too many units to stand and hold at all costs. And he will do that all the way up the river. And he will lose the 20 best divisions in his army. And they will essentially be gone by May of 38. The rest of the Chinese, Wuhan, and then from Wuhan upriver to Chongqing. And for all intents and purposes, the nationalists are not going to fight the Japanese from 1938 till 1945. Now, the communists like to say they were the ones that fought the Japanese. They tried. In August of 1940, they conducted the 100 Regiments campaign against the Japanese. They attacked in a wide area, did a bit of damage, and the Japanese said, this ain't going to last. 2.7 million dead Chinese later, in the Japanese kill-all, burn-all, loot-all campaign, the communists go home, their tail between their legs, and they don't fight much again either. So for all intents and purposes, the Second World War in China is over by 1940. Except, we're going to start over. Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek hired Captain Claire Chennault, United States Army Air Corps retired, to help build a Chinese Air Force. And he does. In this picture here, he's wearing Chinese wings and a nationalist crest. And as you can see from some of these pictures, we will train a Chinese Air Force. Transports, bombers, and fighters. But they will really not come into any effect until into 44, 45. It takes a long time. And remember, this gives first to Britain, second to Russia, last to China. So it takes a long while. The Mustang that the Flying Tigers will fly with great success under Chennault only come to China because a newer model is being made, so the Brits say, give us the new models rather than the old models that we bought, and the old models go to China. So China is not exactly getting the cream of the crop of our stuff, especially early on. We will, in 1941, start Lend-Lease, and in March of 42, we will begin an advise and assist mission to the Chinese. So we're going to start supplying them through Burma. But we start a little late. This book, which was published last year, The American Mission to China, 1941-1942, Lend-Lease Logistics, Politics, Tangles, Wartime Cooperation is an outstanding book, and it will take you through that effort. Stilwell, Chiang Kai-shek's best buddy. Nobody in their right mind will give one officer 6 commanding officer positions. And that's essentially what he has. He's in Southeast Asia Command. He's in the China-Burma India Command. He is the Chief of Staff. He's the Chief of Staff to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. He's got Chinese Combat Command. The Air Force belongs to the Army. He owns that. And oh, by the way, remember, Captain Chenault, who will only become a major general later on in the war, when they asked the Flying Tigers to reintegrate back in. And then you've got the Chinese Army in India. When the Japanese attack into Burma and drive the British and the Chinese, there were 2 Chinese armies fighting in Burma underneath, essentially, Stilwell's command with the British. When parts of 3 of those divisions will go to Burma, and they will become the kernel around which is built the Chinese Army in India, which is the 3 divisions that Stilwell will charge into Burma in April of '44 with. And oh, by the way, Chiang Kai-shek isn't very good about sending guys down to fill up these divisions so that we can have the Chinese divisions to fight with the British divisions to take Burma back from the Japanese. It is a huge food fight, again, plenty to read about. But at the end of the day, this Chinese army in India, these 3 divisions are Stilwell's. Chiang Kai-shek says, I got 500 and some divisions, you can have those 3. One of them is commanded by a Chinese guy who graduated from Purdue, then graduated from VMI. And he is an officer. Kai-shek will put him under house arrest for the rest of his life because he did such a good job. We will attempt to work with the communists. It's not often that you see an American Army officer get a Legion of Merit from Mao Zedong. But something called the Dixie Mission. In August of 1944, Chiang Kai-shek finally agreed to have an American team go up to Yan'an with the communists at their headquarters so that we could start to work on retrieving downed pilots. It will go far beyond relieving downed pilots. From here, we will free a lot of the prisoners of war that the Japanese took to Manchuria at the end of the war. But at the end of the day, from 1944 to 1947, there was an American Army colonel essentially on Mao Zedong's staff. Hard to believe. I mean, it's not like something we're going to do with Al-Qaeda tomorrow. It's a different game. We will agree, in principle, to train and equip 10 Chinese communist divisions after the war. And we will actually send about 35 officers to Nanjing to begin the process of putting together the lesson plans to train those units and start to move it. You can imagine that Chiang Kai-shek's not very happy about that. Stilwell is relieved, replaced by Wedemeyer. Wedemeyer takes the forces from India, the Y Force, the X Force, the Z Force. Chiang Kai-shek had been promised by Roosevelt at Cairo in November of 1943 the United States would train, advise, and equip 90 divisions and the upper-level headquarters to go along with that. This is what we get to by September of '45. We will have built, trained, equipped, and have advisors with 39 divisions. The United States only built 100 American divisions in World War II, Army divisions, and 6 Marine divisions. We will build 39 Chinese divisions, and it will be called the Alpha Force. We will send 2 Marine divisions in September of 1945 to go into key ports, Qingdao and Tianjin, because we're going to help Chiang Kai-shek bring those 39 divisions and others from southwestern China to eastern China to reoccupy China. Take the surrender from the Japanese. It's a painful process. There's a wonderful thing about this because General Order Number 1 said the Japanese could only surrender to Chiang Kai-shek. They could not surrender to any of the communist units that were in control of some of these areas. So guess what happens? Chiang Kai-shek will essentially order Japanese units to shoot the Chinese communists and not surrender to them. Now, this doesn't work out very well propaganda-wise. It also doesn't do us any good, and it puts these Marines in a hell of a trick, to be blunt. They're trying to stay between the communists and the nationalists and fulfill the role. They send in a two-star general by the name of Hurley, who apparently had been in the Oklahoma National Guard and was a politician. And he will bring Mao, as the picture shows, he will bring Mao and Chiang together and begin to attempt to form a third united front, for lack of a better term. The United States wanted a single China that would be the primary ally of ours in it, because we did not want the re-rise of Japan, and we could see the rise of Russia coming. So China was it. And so we were working to get the communists and the nationalists to come back together, work it out. Now, to say that they're just two normal political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, wasn't exactly the way it was. But at the beginning, Chiang Kai-shek had about 4 million men under arms, and the communists had 1.5 million. In September of 1945, Stalin and Chiang will sign a friendship pact, the non-aggression pact. Stalin was going to... Does it... By the way, supposedly when Hurley got off the plane up in Yan'an, he let out a Cherokee war whoop or something, and all the Chinese communists are sitting around saying, "What is that?" Hurley was not exactly going to work out well. He will get mad because he can't get anything done, and he will just quit the mission and go home. And Truman will turn around to Marshall and say, "I need you to go to China and try to bring something together." So from November of 45 through January of 47, the Marshall mission. What Marshall is trying to do is to get a ceasefire, and we are obviously leaning towards the nationalist side. So we will get absolutely hammered in propaganda by the communists. They are trying to, you can say, look, you're not trying to mediate at all. You're on Chiang Kai-shek's side, you're trying to get our surrender. It does not go well for Marshall. There is an interesting organization called the Executive Headquarters, and in the Executive Headquarters, you get Marshall, one communist, one nationalist. This goes all the way down to the ceasefire inspection teams. One American, one nationalist, one communist. They will go out and investigate. Captain John Birch, who has a very interesting story all on his own. He's the son of missionaries in eastern China. When the Doolittle mission planes start to land in China, he will be helping to round them up. He will bring them back to Chongqing. He will be offered a commission in the United States Army and will take it because he speaks fluent Chinese. And he will be one of the people on one of these inspection teams, and he will be killed. Welcome to the John Birch Society. Okay. Whether you like the Nazis, whether you like the communists, guess who wins? The communists win. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. It is hard to find a lot of Russian support, Soviet support to the communists, but they did seem to let a lot of Japanese equipment fall into their hands. And the other thing they did is they controlled a key port. The port is here, Dalian, Lushun, Port Arthur. So for Chiang to supply his armies for the fights up here with the communists, he had to go through Russia, and Russia wouldn't let him in, or the Soviets wouldn't let him in. So, for those of you that think the Soviets helped the communists win the war, you have evidence. When you try to go back and see the equipment that came to Chiang Kai-shek, that came to Mao, not so fast. So, arguably, Stalin didn't know who was going to win, so he played both sides. And he would have been able to argue, oh, I was good to Chiang, oh, I was good to Mao. And he does. The last U.S. Army officer to lead the advisor group to the nationalists. Because after Marshall goes home, we pick the nationalists. We pick Chiang, and we will begin resupplying him. More supplies than the communists. Trouble is, he didn't have all those divisions that were loyal to him. And they lose. The communists will enter Beijing. The United States will move out. I think of Qingdao, April, May of 49. We essentially are done early 49. This guy, Barr, will command the 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, is a very capable man. He will write a very, very long report that says, by 1948, the only way for Chiang Kai-shek to defeat the communists is if the United States introduces ground combat troops. And again, no matter which party you're from, no, America wasn't ready to introduce hundreds of thousands of American troops back into a land war in 1948. Mao wins, and in December of 49, goes up to see Mao. Mao treats him relatively badly, but Mao needs help to reinvigorate an industrial state and for military equipment. Worse for us, the Korean War will begin in less than a year. There's a great book called Uncertain Partners, Mao, Stalin, and the Korean War, that talks through why Mao and Stalin agreed to let Kim Il-sung attack South. And at the end of the day, Kim came up and said, hey, there's only like 500 Americans. South Korea has been in it, it's been in a nascent insurgency for 5 years. When we go south, the southern people will rise up. It won't last long. And the Americans have put both Korea and Taiwan outside of the defense perimeter. So, Kim Il-sung will attack. We will cross the 38th parallel, and it will be Zhou Enlai, the guy that was Chiang Kai-shek's buddy down at Whampoa in 1924, that the message will be sent through to the United States to tell us not to go north of the 38th parallel. We go north of the 38th parallel, the Chinese will come in October, November of 1949. So about a year from the standing up of the People's Republic of China to when the United States is at war on the Korean Peninsula with the Chinese is about a year. Like I said when I started, Gary talked to you last month about the Asian way of war. I'm making an argument that the Asian way of war was done with American equipment, American organization, American know-how, American advisors, and German advisors, and Russian advisors. So when somebody says there's an Asian way of war, there is. But what role did all this foreign influence play? And then the worst case is, what does it mean for today? So with that, what are your questions? And I got two helpers in here. Gary's here from last week, and
you did not mention Nomahan.
I didn't. I did not. There should be an entire brief on Japanese-Russian relations. Nomahan is a battle between the Japanese Kwangtung Army, and I think Zhukov is in charge of the Russian force on the other side. The Russians and the Japanese go at each other in 1939. But when Hitler attacks into Russia, Stalin understands he can't fight a two-front war. The Japanese and the Russians will make a treaty, a non-aggression pact. Now, according to my readings, at the conference at Tehran, Stalin tells Churchill and Roosevelt, 90 days after the war in Europe ends, I will enter the war in Asia against the Japanese. So, May 8th is VE Day. August 8th, exactly 90 days later, 1.5 million Russians attacked into the Kwangtung Army. So much for the Russians always lying. But yeah, that's a whole other 30 to 40-minute discussion of all those intricacies of the Russian-Japanese relations. But I think it's safe to say they hate each other, and the Kurils is still not solved, the Kuril Islands, and that area, the area of the eastern part of Russia remains problematic for the government in Moscow and in Tokyo. Sir?
I believe Chiang Kai-shek fell out of favor with Franklin Roosevelt, but evidently the Americans did virtually nothing to replace Chiang.
There is a story that Stilwell got a wink and a nod from Roosevelt to assassinate Chiang Kai-shek, and that he went to a brigadier general by the name of Dorn and said, "Hey, Dorn, figure out a way to kill that guy." I wouldn't disbelieve it. It never gets ordered. It never happens. When Roosevelt relieved, when he relieved Stilwell, and I've read the dispatch, it essentially says, I have to uphold the head of state over one of my generals. So that kind of, but by that time, there's this problem of, what's the best way to put it? We don't need the Chinese anymore by 1945. You know, we're about to hit Japan anyway. Are we going to now attack Taiwan and attack Japan from Taiwan? It would take us a while to get back that far. So there's some people that call the China-Burma-India theater the forgotten theater. And all we were trying to do, arguably, is keep Chiang Kai-shek in the war. And there are about 3.5 million Japanese, 1.5 million soldiers, sailors, marine and airmen, and about 2 million civilians that are living in China and Manchuria. And they will be a problem. I got 60,000 Americans in China that I'd like to bring back home in September of 1945. But I got to use ships to try to transport 3.5 million Japanese back to Japan. So it is a very interesting problem set for the Navy and the Merchant Marine to try to figure out how we're going to do this. I mean, we've got like 8 million personnel overseas at the end of the summer of 1945. We've got to somehow get them home. For some, hey, you didn't bring my son home from the den of iniquity, so you could bring 3.5 million Japanese from China? That's not a very good argument for any congressman. Is there another question? Thoughts? I know I jawed on for a long time, so that made questions kind of go downhill. But I think, you know, you can tell that this is an amazingly interesting time, and there's a lot that we don't know about it. The Chinese archives are not exactly open, and if they've been opened, you've got to speak Chinese very well to get into them, and I don't. But there are some very good books that are being written up there, being written right now. The last one is by a Professor Rana Mitter, who's a Brit, who wrote Forgotten Ally. And his argument is that the China was more important final victory in World War II than any of us now admit to. So hopefully I've given you some ideas of things you might want to read, take a look at, study. Oh, I know, I should have done more on Japan, but I knew you'd be here.
Should have done more on Japan. You observed that that the Asian armies, East Asian armies, Japanese army, Chinese army, follow Westernization, Western advisors, and so on. But my question is, do you nevertheless, in this period, see principles of war operating in the Red Army that are different from those of their Western counterparts?
Yep, I'm going to... At CGSC right now, we teach the Western way of war. My lesson tomorrow is the American way of war. We've looked at the Germans and Blitzkrieg, the Germans and how they changed from World War I, come into Blitzkrieg, go into the Second World War. We watched the Russian army, first the failure of the Tsar's army, and then the rise of a very, very competent, cutting-edge army thinking at the operational level, and then Stalin essentially assassinates his officer corps, and a new one gets brought up, except for Zhukov and some others. So in my personal opinion, this idea of finding a national way of war, or even an orientation towards a way of war, is a very difficult thing. So we tend to talk about the nature of war. The nature of war is immutable, never changes. It's violent, it's chaotic. In a Clausewitzian sense, there's fog and friction, and that never goes away. Now, there are some, how do I say this nicely, Air Force guys who think that you can take the fog of war away, that the perfect targeting layout will be there. Not so fast. So the nature of war doesn't change, but the way that an army conducts a war, I'm more and more convinced there's no single way of war. It mutates, it changes, this characteristic of how you fight. But it's a great question because it's asked every day. If the Chinese become the peer competitor that some think it's going to become, and if the Thucydides trap that says when a greater power is overtaken by another power, which has happened 10 times in history, and 7 times out of 10 it means war. If war with the Chinese are inevitable, what does it look like? And how will they fight? And that is, I think, still problematic. So you'll read one way or the other. I have another slide or two. My personal opinion, the Chinese are moving back to Confucianism. So one, the Chinese will know what the hell they're getting into when they get into it. It will be a decision. The very first line of Sun Tzu is, of Art of War, Sun Tzu's Art of War is the most important activity of the state. It must be thoroughly studied. So none of this just like, I think I'll go to war tomorrow. It's going to be studied. And then this other piece sounds like an American political movement. China's 1/5 of mankind. So I'd ask any general that wants to go to war with China, are you sure you want to go to war with 1/5 of mankind? I mean, I think Bradley, who originally says, no land wars in Asia. Well, okay, you Navy guys and Air Force guys, you can go do what you like. Then I'll give you 2 slides of what I think. I think the Chinese are defensive. I think their main avenue is to win without fighting, which means diplomacy. I think they're prudent. I think they're pragmatic. I think they're cautious and calculating. But face is important. And so harmony is wonderful, but so are heroics. Sir?
The Chinese have 1.4 billion people. We have 335 million. Numbers do matter.
Yes. I would remind some politicians of that. I mean, it's like Taiwan. There's like 2 million people from Taiwan living and working in mainland China on any given moment. They're the ones that are running the factories that are making your cell phones. They're being run with Taiwanese managerial talent. What we would say is that's 2 million hostages on any given afternoon when the war breaks out with Taiwan. Not a likely thing to happen. Any other questions, thoughts? Sure.
You pointed out that the fighting in China more or less stopped between Japanese and nationalists after 1938, and between Mao's armies and the Japanese, December 1940, I think you said. My impression has been that even after the major engagements between conventional forces cease, that you have a simmering guerrilla war in northeast China that's widespread, that's going on everywhere all the time, with the Japanese in the cities and on the major rail lines joining them, and the Chinese communist guerrillas everywhere else, not only everywhere else, but constantly organizing, constantly active, constantly attriting the Japanese every way they can. And that that the scale of this engagement, millions of people, millions of Japanese soldiers and tens of millions of Chinese, that the scale of this hostility spread everywhere resulted in millions of deaths on both sides. And that when people say that the Chinese theater is decisive, I think some of them have that in mind. This horrendous bloodletting of the Japanese also costly the Chinese in northeast China, almost all of which is guerrilla action, not conventional action. Could you comment on that?
I hope it's your next book, Dr. Huber. No, again, I think that it's, after the war, a lot of Japanese officers were interviewed, and the documents of their interviews have been translated, are there. And so we should, in my opinion, you're absolutely right, we should know more about the nationalist Japanese and the communist Japanese fight than we do. But there's surprisingly little written on it. And in 1944, the Japanese were able to put together, was it April of 44, Ichigo? They put together the biggest and best campaign of the war. They were trying to basically link Japan to Korea to China to Vietnam and beyond so that they could get supplies from Southeast Asia and they wouldn't have to go to sea because the United States Navy had essentially blocked the sea. So if the Japanese had been completely debilitated by either the 560 nationalist divisions or the 1.5 million communists, they still put together an amazing offensive, and they were still thinking about how to fight this war and win it into 1945. So I'm waiting for the best book to be written on that looks at the sources. But the Japanese were still a strong army in China in 45. Ask backwards way of answering that question, I guess. Sir?
What was the primary impetus for the United States to open Japan in the 1840s?
Would you please answer that? I'll let Tom Huber, who's the expert on, especially on that era, says my answering it would be because I studied it from him. So if you don't mind, I'd let the expert answer it.
I'll try to answer briefly. What was the question again?
Why did we open up Japan in the 1850s?
It's Admiral Perry. He has a small fleet going into Edo Bay, what's now Tokyo Bay, and I think the Americans wanted to establish a naval presence in the Pacific, and Japan was the closest power there. The British were in China. The U.S. felt that they could make their mark by opening Japan. They saw it as a rich country, rich market, a way for the Americans to establish their flag in East Asia at a place that was, for them, close.
Remember, 25 years later, we'll buy Alaska. So, yeah, naval presence. The French are in Indochina, the Brits and Germans and others are in China. Japan looks like an interesting place to go.
Yeah, that's my short take, anyhow.
And I totally agree with the master. Any other questions? Right, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting.